Hello, everybody. My name is Ian McLaughlin, and I have a PhD in neuroscience. And a few weeks ago, I talked about a topic that has gotten a lot of attention very rapidly, all of a sudden, after the findings of a lab at the University of Exeter in the United Kingdom. It's a topic called aphantasia, or a condition or a characterization of consciousness. We'll get into a little bit more of the details, but with me today, we are all fortunate to be joined by the Hoopers, by Angela Hooper and Deanna Hooper, her daughter. But before we get to our honored guests, I have a question for you. And I talked about aphantasia maybe 2 weeks ago, but I have a question for you. And it sounds like it's simple, but the results can be complicated. So on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being no image at all, like you experience no visual experience, and 5 being your experience is as though it's really happening to you. I want you to put out your palm right in front of you with your palm facing up, and imagine a butterfly just landed on your palm. And imagine that maybe it's it's sort of flapping its wings kind of slowly. They do that in that sort of playful way. Maybe you can imagine what its legs might look like, on your palm. Maybe you can imagine them tickling you. So on a scale of 1 to 5, once again, with 1 being no image at all, just an awareness of what it would be like, and 5 being there might as well have been a butterfly that just landed on your palm. Rate your visual experience. And so just keep that in mind, and there'll be a couple other little prompts that I'll bring up as well. But just keep that in mind as we talk to our wonderful guests. So first we have Deanna C. Hooper, a theoretical physicist.
Hey, thanks for
and
having
we have
me.
her mother. Of course, it's always a pleasure. And we have her mother, Angela Hooper. Hey,
hello,
Angela.
Hello, everybody. Nice to be here. Thank you, Ian, for having me.
Oh, of course, it's my pleasure. And so one of the questions that has always been interesting to me is whether or not there might be some kind of familial component, genetic component, heritable component to aphantasia. But so for both of you, maybe we'll start with Deanna. On a scale of 1 to 5 for that butterfly exercise, what was your experience like?
Definitely a 4.
4. So the way that the scientists who have characterized aphantasia, or at least the leading scientists, would call 4 basically a pretty realistic visual experience, pretty vivid, not quite as though you're seeing a butterfly actually landing on your palm, but pretty close. And then Angela, what about you?
0. Absolutely 0.
Me too. So all right, and so I would love to hear what some of the folks in the audience, what their experiences are like, and this is going to be a little bit less formal, a little bit less produced, I suppose, than what I normally do, and so we are all going to be very interested to hear what your experiences are. Hey, Carrie, thank you for joining. Hey, Tanner, Scott, awesome to see you. And David, and Watchmaker on YouTube, awesome. And so Scott says he is a 2, maybe a 2.5, if you're allowing non-whole numbers. You're breaking the rules, Scott. It's got to be a whole number. But I do completely sympathize with that desire to sort of find a little bit more nuance. But the advantage to keeping it a sort of simple scale is that it's much easier to standardize everything. And hey, Christian Zasa is here, a fellow scientist. And so, it'd be really interesting to hear what your reaction is. And hey, Betty, thank you for joining, and thank you very much for the award, Christian. Okay, so part of the difficulty in this sort of prompt, in this challenge, is that I think it can be difficult to be certain that we're using language in precisely the same way. And so I'd like to explore a little bit more, Deanna, your experience of the butterfly landing on your palm. So you say definitely a 4. And so could you characterize what that visual experience is like?
So I can very much imagine what the butterfly is doing. The butterfly is fluttering its wings, and if I concentrate, I can see the butterfly there. But I know it's not a real visual experience because I know that if I touch it, there is no butterfly there. Right? If I want to, I can imagine the feeling of the feet as well, moving around, maybe this like fluttering of the wings as it touches my hand. I can make the butterfly change color. There was a nice question by David of what species of butterfly. I started with the blue butterfly because that's the one you prompted us with, but I can immediately change it to be a white butterfly, an orange one, and whichever color. I could make it a pink one with blue spots, and it's there. It's now a pink butterfly with blue spots on my hand. But I don't use a 5 because I know it's not a full visual experience.
And so do you have to close your eyes, or does closing your eyes help?
It sometimes helps if I'm working out the finer details, like if you want me to put small white dots around the blue dots on the pink butterfly, maybe I would close my eyes. But just for the butterfly itself, I don't need to close my eyes for it.
So what happens to the background behind the butterfly that isn't there? Do you still see the background, or is
like if the butterfly is on my palm, it's kind of blocking out my fingers, right? I know my fingers are still there. I can still see them if I want to, but I can put the butterfly like really in front of my fingers.
Wow.
Okay, and then so Angela, I suspect that so I'm on the same page. That 1 is the lowest number that Adam Zeman, Dr. Adam Zeman at the University of Exeter, that he permits people to respond. But if I could give a 0, I would absolutely give a 0.
Yeah.
And the way that folks who would respond in the way that we respond, aphantasiacs, in other words, that they're limited to just knowing that you're being prompted to imagine this butterfly. But so for you, it is just you're looking at your hand, right?
Not even. If I look at my hand, yeah, that's it. I just see my hand with my eyes closed or my eyes open. If my eyes closed, I don't even see my hand, to the point that I couldn't remember. Obviously, I can feel how many fingers are up or how many are down, but I wouldn't remember anything. I wouldn't see anything. So it's the concept of knowing. I can imagine a butterfly, but I cannot see it.
Okay. And so we see David is probably a 4. Hey, Abyss, thanks for joining, man. Yeah, it'd be interesting to know, Abyss, how you would respond on the 1 to 5 scale. And to be clear, this butterfly exercise that I like to use, first of all, I just like to do it because I think butterflies are very beautiful. But I also think that they're very vivid and sort of easy to imagine because, most of us, I imagine, have seen a butterfly before. But the team at the University of Exeter, they have a whole process by which, several different prompts. And so to give, oh wait, I actually don't have them in front of me. But so they have a scale, right, called the Vividness of Visualization IQ, VVIQ. And it is, a series of questions that they prompt their study participants to go through. And so they conducted this study in 2015, and this was after Adam Zeman had been working with a gentleman who is 65 years old, had an angioplasty, which is a form of surgery to allow blood to flow more effectively through arteries. And it turned out that following that procedure, this guy, I think he calls him MX, reported that he could no longer visualize. And so this is a person who had started with the ability to visualize and then noticed a change. And he's not the only person to have reported something like that. We've also seen folks who reported something similar. There was a woman in the Czech Republic who noticed, she woke up one day and noticed she could no longer visualize. And she was very concerned, so she went to the hospital and said, "There's something up. Will you please scan my brain?" And then, which would never happen in the United States. You can just ask to have your brain scanned. And so they did. And it turned out that she did indeed have a stroke. And they were able to localize, specific parts of the brain that were affected. That's, how you know if somebody's had a stroke. And there are a couple other examples of this, right? But broadly speaking, generally, most people who then reached out to Adam Zeman after this story of the 65-year-old man who had his angioplasty surgery, most people reached out and said, "This is how I've always been." And so we can look at some of the results briefly here. Let's see how this is going to work. Why not? That's okay. And so as you can see on the top, these are folks who characterize themselves as having aphantasia or being unable to visualize. And on the bottom is just a group of people, like normal people who, normal people, people who still sustain the ability to visualize. And on the bottom, the x-axis, the bottom scale is the VVIQ score, right? So you respond with a 1 on the first prompt to imagine a sunset. You respond with a 2 on the second prompt to imagine a Christmas tree or something. So you go through this whole series, and then you aggregate all those numbers. You add all the numbers up, and then you get this VVIQ score. The lowest score you can get is 16. And that is if you answered a 1 on every one of their questions, and then the highest is an 80. And so as you can see on the bottom, these are people who can visualize, right? And you see, a range, but essentially none of them answered with 1, consistently. Whereas on the top, the aphantasiacs, pretty tightly clustered. The majority of them were just a 1 on every single question, like Angela and I would have responded. A couple had, a few, maybe a 2 or something like that, maybe a 3. And so all of a sudden, this seemed like it was a real thing. Now, in my experience, when I talk to people, particularly scientists, interestingly, and we engage the prospect that perhaps they have aphantasia, there's a very emotional reaction, right? They become startled, and like I've had heated debates. In fact, just 2 days ago, I had a pretty heated debate with a very good friend of mine, scientist, a chemical engineer, and she got very hung up on and we tried to explore the contours of this conversation. Visualize, right? What do you mean by visualize? And so, Deanna, I'm interested, when you're asked to visualize something, right? What is that exercise like? Are you experiencing a visual experience, or is it more of a knowing of, okay, you're sort of walking through the motions of what it would feel like to know what somebody's asking you to visualize? What's the exercise like for you?
So it's like piecing together different frames from movies, right? I know my hand is here. So then I have the movie of the butterfly, and I just superimpose it so that then I see. There was also the question before, do I see it in like disjointed frames or as a continuous video? And I would say it's a continuous video. I can see the butterfly like coming around, landing, staying here on my hand. But it's really just like producing the movie first in my mind and then kind of projecting it onto my hand. I'm not sure how else to define visualizing.
That's part of the difficulty, right? And so, Angela, what about for you? I mean, I'm sure I know when I going through school and stuff, coaches, for sports and stuff would ask me to visualize things. Have you ever been asked to visualize things? And if so, what is the exercise like for you?
Yeah, a couple of years ago, I was actually seeing a sleep therapist, and I spent one of those nights under a sleep watch with 6 billion wires tied up and a camera over your head, and you're supposed to sleep, which obviously you don't. So the sleep therapist was trying to help me kind of meditate my way into a sleep. So she was saying, see yourself on a beach. I can think of my favorite beach. Okay, I'm thinking of my favorite beach. Look at the water. I know the water's cold. I know it's blue. So it kind of has more of a descriptive tone. I find that my mind basically doesn't shut up because it's narrating the concept of everything else, everything visual. It's narrating all the time. Which is why I was seeing a sleep therapist, because obviously narrating at 3 a.m. in the morning is no fun.
That's interesting. I have, ever since puberty, actually, I have been a terrible, terrible sleeper. And so it's interesting that the two aphantasiacs. So what about you, Deanna? Do you fall asleep readily?
No, I have trouble sleeping. Usually my mind is way too active and I can't shut it up.
Yeah, but that's your doctor thing.
Yeah, it's usually physics or just overthinking things, stressing about everything that can possibly be stressed about. So just standard stuff.
Okay. Interesting, because there are some data to suggest that there is a relationship between certain psychiatric conditions, particularly anxiety, and aphantasia. That isn't sort of thoroughly explored, which is why I haven't really gone into it very much. But so another thing that we all share is a love of science fiction. And in fact, I happen to have learned that Deanna is named after a character in science fiction, but not necessarily a novel, right, or a science fiction book. But so what I'm curious, I love science fiction. It's a large reason for my motivation to get into science. But so when you all read science fiction, or you read fiction in general, it doesn't have to be science fiction, what is the experience like? Are you picturing, visualizing all the scenes throughout the book, or are you just reading the words and sort of just knowing what the author is trying to convey? Deanna, what's your experience like?
I very much feel like I'm walking around the scene in the book. So that's also why I always like reading books before movies, because if I get to read the book first, I can construct the movie in my mind however I like without having the prejudice of in the movie they did it like this. Right? So if I'm reading a book, I really imagine what I'm reading. That's why I like descriptive novels a lot more, because the more description they provide, the more I can build up the scene around me. And I usually feel like I'm kind of walking along next to the main characters or whichever character is being described and experiencing the world with them. I think that's how I would describe it.
Yeah, I can understand. I certainly can't take that experience on. But Angela, I don't know if you read very much fiction, but if you do, what's your experience like?
It's the knowledge of the concept. I understand what they're saying. It's a very emotive process for me. If I'm reading a book that describes a beautiful scene, a beautiful mountain or a glacier or something, it feels very emotional, and I can feel the connection of being there, but I don't see anything.
Gotcha. But do you enjoy fiction?
Yeah, definitely.
Interesting. So very similar experience for me. I am driven much more by the emotional experience of the story, far more so than the scenes that are being portrayed. Although I enjoy that too, but it turns out that in conversations with folks who would characterize themselves as having aphantasia or being an aphantasiac, there can tend to be an aversion to that sort of that form of fiction where the authors spend quite a bit of ink on describing a scene. And for me, I do tend to, I appreciate describing a scene, of course, right? But for me, if an author
past it or read it a little bit quickly, like that bit,
exactly, yeah. So
yeah,
for me, if there are some authors that just spend so much time describing a scene as opposed to just like telling you where it's happening and giving you a little bit of something to jog your imagination. But yeah, for me, if they're just going on and on and on about the height and the size of the nose and like all this stuff, I do just start to skim that part of the story.
I kind of skip through until it gets back to actual action or dialogue, and then I'll read that bit. So I often skip the planet is green with yellow plants or whatever.
Yeah,
I do the same.
But for me, the more description I have, the more like real the visual experience becomes. If I just have a person and a tree, I can't really place everything. I will just fill in the blanks. But if the author takes the time to tell me there's grass and leaves falling, it's like, okay, now the floor is fixed as well. Is it daylight? All of these details come into play in the picture.
Interesting.
So if they're missing, I'll come up with the missing details.
Gotcha. And so Christian Zasa, which by the way, for anybody who's unfamiliar, you should rectify that quickly and check out his streams here on HAP. Some really beautiful nature photography, nature videography, as well as he also does astrophotography. So everybody should check his stuff out. But so Christian brings up, can you play chess blind and see thy moves or see your moves, see the moves, I assume. And we were having a brief conversation before we went live. So Deanna, what is your relationship with chess, and can you rely on your ability to visualize?
So I learned to play chess at a young age, and I would play often with my dad, and he was a very annoying chess player in the sense that he always won. He knew exactly what you were going to do before you did it. Very annoying to play against. We tried a few times playing without a physical board. So he would start with like, okay, pawn to e5, like, okay, pawn to f6. And we go on for a bit and do a couple of moves like this. I could usually get about 5 moves each into the game, so about 10 moves in total. And this was just having the board in our mind and like moving the pieces. And after about a total of 10 moves, or 5 each, the board would become fuzzy and some of the pieces would start disappearing. It's like, wait, where's my bishop again? I couldn't keep up at that point. I knew that he could have continued the full game if we'd gone. So that's also why I give mine a 4 and not 5, because I know that there are people who have more visual experience, and for him it would have definitely been a 5. But
You might actually recall a time when you were doing that, and I walked up to where this imaginary chessboard was and shook it, and
yeah,
you felt quite stressed. And he said, "Don't worry, I'll put them back." And then kind of, I don't know, put
yeah.
them back where they were. And Deanna said, "Oh yeah, that's right," and carried on. And I just thought, these guys are weird.
Yeah, yeah, and for me, every time I kind of had to remember all of the pieces. So I would always start with the chessboard with the pieces in their ordered positions. Like, okay, first we moved here, then we moved here, then we did here. And I had to reconstruct it at every step, which is why a few in, it was like, okay, I can't keep up with this anymore. But I think in my dad's case, he didn't have to reconstruct it, but each time he just brought up the new board with the pieces in their exact position. So we tried it a few times. We never got a full game in, except once when he beat me in 4 moves because I forgot the basic 4-move checkmate in the visual one. But otherwise, we never got a full game in. But it was definitely a fun exercise.
Yeah, and so how old were you when you were engaging in this sort of challenge?
I would say this was 13, 14 or so, around early teens.
Okay. And this is something you did fairly regularly, or at least more than once. Do you feel like the repetition of doing that made you better at visualizing, or made you sort of improve your skills in this challenge?
It definitely made me improve my skills and become more aware of where all the pieces were, which also helped me improve as a chess player in general, because sometimes you kind of forget where you put your pieces. And here you really had to keep everything in mind, because you couldn't just glance around like, oh, where's my queen? So you really had to keep everything in mind. So I think it definitely helped me improve as a chess player. And it did help me improve with my memory. But we did this quite a few times. We never got too far into the game at some point, like, I can't do this anymore, okay. But I definitely think it helped me improve my memory and my overall visualization, at least of the chessboard.
So that brings up the next topic I'd love to discuss, which is the relationship between visualization and memory. So one of the things that, one of the correlations that the group at the University of Exeter has found is that there seems to be a relationship between deficient or disrupted autobiographical memory in general, and folks who would rank very low on the VVIQ score, right? Maybe, completely zeros, people who would be characterized as having aphantasia. And so, Angela, when it comes to remembering something, what is that exercise for you? Like, what's that process? If I ask you to remember, what it was like when you were having dinner last night, what is that process? What is that experience for you?
I have very bad short-term memory, and I always have had, but I'm not a youngster anymore, so I do know that it gets worse with age, of course. But I can recall details of crazy events years ago and several things, but to ask what I ate for dinner yesterday would not actually be easy for me to recall. I would probably say I was at my table, but that's more about habit than remembrance. So I certainly couldn't visualize it, but I couldn't construct that memory very well.
And then for you, Deanna, what is the process of remembering what you had for dinner last night like?
Well, I think in this case, asking me about food gives me a slight advantage, because I do actually log my food daily, so I can literally pick up my app and tell you exactly what I've eaten for the last 4 years. But yeah,
somehow I'm unsurprised.
If I want to go back to this memory, I just think, okay, we were sat here at the dinner table, I was sat over here, my partner was sat there, this is what was on our plate. I got back from a busy day. I can remember the experience of sitting down, having really tasty sweet potato chickpea curry yesterday for dinner. Yeah, it's like if I think about it enough, I can remember exactly the flavor and like the
Can you taste it?
I can't directly taste it, but I can remember the experience of tasting it. Like, it's my favorite dish. We sat down, we had dinner, there was the news on, had some conversations. Yeah, I can kind of like play back this memory. And some bits are a bit foggy. Like, if you ask me exactly where was a knife and fork on the plate, no idea. But it feels like a movie with some gaps missing, with some elements blurred out that I can't completely place, but the main elements I can see.
But there is a visual component to exploring that memory.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely.
Gotcha.
It's like watching a fractured film in my mind.
Gotcha. And so Angela, you brought up, can you conjure taste, right? So when it comes to visualization, you're essentially conjuring an image in your mind's eye, right? It is fundamentally a sensory experience. And there are some interesting correlations when it comes to folks who would rank very low on the VVIQ score having aphantasia, and how they and their relationship with other sensory systems. Like, can you conjure particularly auditory sound?
Yeah.
You know, can you conjure a song in your mind, or a flavor, or even a tactile experience? And so, Angela, what is your relationship with these other senses? Can you, conjure the sound of a trumpet and actually have an auditory experience?
No, and even to the point of voices, my husband's voice, who I was with for 36 years, I would know his voice anywhere. But can I hear it now? Can I make myself hear it? No. So not any sounds. I know what a cat meow sounds like because I have 600 cats around me. But I can't hear it, but I can imagine it. I can feel it. It feels stronger to me than just one sense.
And for you, Deanna, are you able to conjure other sensory experiences?
I think sounds, definitely. It's like if I get a message from you, I will kind of hear it playing in your voice in my mind. Right? If I read a message from somebody,
Really?
I will, yeah. So like if I've interacted with a person and I know their voice, I will hear the message in their voice. Like when I read it, it plays in their voice and their kind of mannerisms. Tastes I cannot conjure, and smells I cannot conjure. I can think about it, like I can remember the experience of having smelled this, but I can't conjure it on demand. But sounds I can definitely conjure on demand. It's much easier if it's a sound I've heard. So like if you ask me to imagine your voice saying something I've never heard you say, that would be a lot harder than hearing you say something I've heard you say in my mind.
So when I send you a WhatsApp message, do you hear me reading it to you?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
It's like we're having a conversation, right? I hear it in your voice.
And your messages you hear in your own voice?
Yes. Yeah, wow. It's like I'm talking them to myself as I'm typing them, right?
Ian, what are your auditory mind like?
Yeah. So when it comes to the broader population of people who would describe themselves as having aphantasia, there does seem to be some diversity there, where some folks will say, I cannot conjure any visual experience, but I can do so when it comes to auditory experiences. So it's not like if you're a 1 on visual, you're a 1 on everything else. There does seem to be some diversity there. So for me, I would probably be maybe a 2, maybe, when it comes to auditory stuff. I learned the piano when I was very, very young, and music has always been a very important part of my life. And I never actually learned to read sheet music. I mean, I did, but not very effectively. I always relied on my ear to learn a song. And so I don't think I could do the equivalent, whatever that would be, for visualization. So I do think that I'm better at conjuring auditory experiences than visual. But so this brings us to another thing that we can explore, which is how it is that you dream. So not everybody remembers their dreams very frequently at all, right? So, but that's a different topic. And dreams can come in all kinds of forms of experience. And it turns out that a lot of the folks who would rank, again, low as aphantasiacs, let's just say, will report that they do have visual components to their dreams. But many also do not. So Angela, I'm curious, if you do dream or you do remember your dreams, is there any visual component to it, or is it just like a black screen?
I think so. When I'm asleep, yeah, I think when I'm asleep, maybe I see it in visual. It's quite, I can actually control my dreams to a certain extent, and if I know that this path is dangerous, I can say no, go this way or something. So I have quite active dreams. When I wake up, I don't see any residue, but I feel the emotion of it very strongly. So if it's something like a scary dream, the impact is very strong, and I can wake up with hot sweats and beating strange heartbeats. But I think when I'm asleep, I think it's visual, but it's hard to say, because when I wake up, the moment I have a conscious thought, there's not any visual aspect. It's just the description. In answer, actually, Andrew actually asked, do I have in a monologue non-stop? And I think that's part of the dream thing as well, is that it narrates what's happening all the time, which is why I'm able to control the direction of the dream. and when I wake up, I feel the concept of it, but I can't see any images.
Interesting. And what about for you, Deanna? What are your dreams like?
Very vivid, I would say, very much like being in a film. Like the whole scene is playing out around me. Some details are not clear because they're not relevant to the random plot lines that my subconscious comes up with. But the details that are relevant, I can really see them. There's also the annoying thing sometimes if I'm like just at a stage between dreaming and waking up, where sometimes it actually feels like my dreams kind of follow me into the room. Especially with scary dreams, that's horrible. It's like I just as an example, if I'm like being chased by a demon and then I wake up and I'm in that in between state, and sometimes I really see the demon in the room. It's like, okay, you know it's not there, you know. But there's this moment where it feels like the visual experience follows me into the waking world, which is not so fun with nightmares.
Yeah, so for me, there is a visual component to my dreams for sure, but you know, it's not. I don't always remember my dreams and so on, but for vivid dreams, yeah, there's definitely a visual component to it, and there's even, despite my complete lack of any capability to visualize while I'm awake and fully conscious, I've had some experiences where, as I'm falling asleep with my eyes closed, I can actually see my room. Like I can look around my room and like literally, it's very strange. The first time it happened, it's just sort of jarring because you feel like you're awake. And like usually in my dream, if I try to move my head, then like consciously I'll tend to wake up. But I've had this experience now a few times where and it's like I can even remember like the precise conformation of my blanket on top of me, or where certain things that I left on my desk. And so it doesn't happen very regularly, but it is sort of surprising that it happens because it's so foreign to my typical life, my waking life, my typical daily experience. And so Andrew brought up inner monologue, which brings me to another topic that I'm curious to explore with you all. When you are reading, do you narrate the words to yourself as you're reading, or do you sort of scan the words and just sort of ingest them via some other mechanism? Deanna, what is it like when you read?
It completely depends on what I'm reading. So it used to be the case that I wouldn't really like read the words in my mind. I would just directly launch into this like movie playing out in my mind. Right? But now I've gradually stopped reading for pleasure because of academia. And now when I actually pick up a fiction book or any type of novel, I find that I am mentally reading the words. I'm repeating them in my mind before conjuring up this film. So there's like an added step now in the process. But first I need to really be aware of what I'm reading, and then I can construct a visualization. And I think it's because now I've just switched to reading mainly academic papers where I don't need to visualize, because you can't visualize most of those concepts. And at that point, I don't have this playing out. So now when I actually read for pleasure, I find that is lacking. And that's something that always annoys me, because it's like this extra step of reading the words in my mind before enjoying them. And I think that's one of the reasons that I no longer read so much.
Interesting. And I certainly empathize with your the transition to exclusively reading scientific material. That definitely happened to me in graduate school and in college. And then, so what about for you, Angela? Do you narrate the words that you're reading?
Yes, I do, but I don't hear a voice. Andrea actually asked whose voice my inner monologue is. I don't hear my voice, and I don't hear the words of the book. I don't hear it in any voice. I feel it. I read the concept. I understand the concept, and I don't read word, but it's not the fox is brown. It's not reading the word, but I don't hear it either. It's I wouldn't say I scan read, but it's more, I see the words, I feel the words, I skip the boring bits that say blue, green, yellow, high, tall, etc. Any pages of adjectives, and then I just focus on the story and the feeling of the story.
Interesting.
My cat, I don't know if you guys can all hear this, by the way, my cat is howling downstairs.
Can't hear him, but I know which one that is.
He sounds like
if you need to go check.
No, he does it because he can't see me, so he's just howling, and he sounds like a little demon.
Well, your microphone is doing a good job of selecting for your voice.
Hopefully, Vader, you can hear him.
And so that is kind of like aphantasia, where, you know, again, I've had some heated, like I had a friend, you know, we had some drinks in, you know, outside at my where I live, whatever, and we got into this topic, and she had a very severely emotional reaction as she started to learn that, you know, maybe my concept of my consciousness is completely different. And she went home and we continued exploring the topic. And there's this other thing that sort of came up on the internet. It was a little bit viral for a little while, which is, wait a second, you narrate, or you don't narrate what you're reading? Where people sort of came to the realization that not everybody engages something as simple and everyday as mundane as reading, in completely different ways. So yeah, it's always interesting to me that, you know, this is such a personal experience. And so Abyss says he's a 4 to a 5. It depends on my lucidity. If I'm on the verge of sleeping, I can conjure the most elaborate images and high definition videos of things that I want to imagine. That's interesting because that sort of sounds, you know, familiar to me. Okay, so yeah, and so Stanley brings up, what is the difference between imagination and visualizing? And this is essentially what I have typically spent the majority of time trying to standardize when I have conversations with scientists, which is like, you know, as we explored before, what is visualizing? Like, what do you mean by that? And so, you know, when you're asked to imagine something, Angela, you know, what are you doing in that moment when you're asked to imagine something as opposed to visualize something? Are they synonyms? Are they identical?
No, I can imagine very easily. I have a very, I would describe it as a very vivid imagination, which might sound contradictory because it's not images, but I can take the idea of a story. If you give me the basic idea of a story, I can take it and run with it and create an amazing story, an amazing narrative in my head. I do this with people watching. I see somebody with something on the train and I conduct a whole story, and by the time I get off this train, I've got their whole life mapped out, and it's a fascinating story. And I think none of it is visual. It's all completely the unvoiced narrative in my head.
Interesting. Yeah, I play the same game with my wife, which is you construct a story based off of what somebody looks like, you know, at Rittenhouse Square here in Philly. And so what about for you, Deanna? Is imagination, or is imagining something and visualizing something essentially the same exercise?
Mostly, but it depends. If I want to imagine something very quickly, I might skip most of the visual details and just like get to the point. Right? Like if you say, imagine getting off a plane. Okay, I can see myself walking off the plane, but if we need to do quick fire rounds, then it's just plane, me. Like there's a plane there's me. I don't have any details of the airport. I don't know which country I'm in. But I would say they're very entangled. Like when I imagine things, I usually see them. It's my first response to imagining something is to construct it in my mind. So I think I do have a very strong visual aspect, but I can kind of skip by most of the details if I need to imagine something quickly.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, it certainly makes sense. If I could conjure visual images, I would probably lean pretty heavily on it. And so Christian says, he's talking about remembering the digits of pi. And so he says, for example, I could recite the number pi to 314 digits. Wow, by visualizing a landscape. Interesting. Yeah. And so, you know, like as you imagine things, you rely on visualization. Both of you have, you know, in your careers have done sort of science-related things, and so for you, Deanna, you know, I know that you work you engage some of the most exotic components of the universe that we literally can't see, and so do you rely very much on visualizing things for your work, or is it all just, you know, code and numbers?
Yeah, it's weird, right? Because I can't really visualize dark matter and stuff like that because it's not really there. So I think when thinking about scientific concepts, I try to visualize the connections between them. So kind of like the typical serial killer wall with things with post-its and tape tying it together. If I'm working on a new concept, I will construct one of these walls where I put different ideas and see if I can tie a red thread between them. This does help me to really relate concepts. But I think most of the time my work is highly non-visual because it really is coding numbers and staring at figures. But I do think that visual memory, or not necessarily memory, but this visualization has helped me during exams. Because usually I'm very good at remembering numbers and formulas, but less good at remembering the actual text that I'm supposed to remember for an exam. But I realized at some point that if before going into the exam, I would write kind of a cheat sheet and then not take it with me, but just write out this cheat sheet. When I'm sat in an exam, I can mentally bring up the cheat sheet, not all of the details, but mainly the location. It's like, which part of the paper did I write this theorem on? And then I kind of zoom in on that part of the paper, and I can't necessarily see all of the words, but maybe I get one or two words, and it's like zooming in mentally into this part of the paper. That's constructed from when I write out my cheat sheet. So I often joke that just writing the cheat sheet was enough for me to then have it mostly in mind. Not all of the details, but enough to kind of move around. But if I forgot where something was on my cheat sheet, there was no way I was going to remember anything about it. So I had to remember, like, it's down here, and then I could remember. But otherwise, it was gone.
So that there's almost a spatial component to the memory. But one of the most brilliant people I ever met was in high school. His memory was unbelievably, like, just so accurate. And it seemed like he could remember anything he wanted to remember. And so once I asked him, it sort of became a curse because he relied very heavily on doing that as he went through college, and that didn't always serve him well. But I asked him, so what is this process of you being able to remember, some obscure thing, about whatever, some history, for a history test? And he says, I look at the page in my mind. I see the page. And so for me, that would be impossible. And so Angela, do you feel that, aphantasia or your relationship with visualization has affected your career choices or your professional decisions?
It probably has. Before I answer that fully, I was nodding in agreement with you because your colleague, your roommate back in college, my husband was the same, and he would actually go as far as say, it's on page 7, line 4, about 3 words in.
Which could be very annoying.
Yeah, there's no doubt. That was possibly the most annoying thing. Where does it say this? And he would say on page. It actually definitely affected his choice of work. He worked in proposals with large companies, and he could go through and recite to all of his clients immediately, this part of this clause is on page 731, line 17. And they'd be like, wait, are you on page 731 already? And he would just zip through it. So that definitely, I would say, had an impact on his choice of career because his visualization, his almost, I guess, photographic memory helped him in that kind of way. For me, mine is much more organizational. My career has always been much more organizational and functional. And I think this is part of the fact that my brain is always thinking solutions. And because one of the great examples is those god awful visual diagram things that you get a flat thing and you're supposed to what shape is this, and apparently it's a dodecahedron or something, and I look at it and think, okay, so I'm going to cut it out and build it. So I think because I had to find a solution other than looking at it, it's made me more of a logical person and more administrative, I guess.
That's an interesting interesting that you've noticed that. I think for me, probably it has influenced my career decisions. And it does turn out that, as the group at the University of Exeter sort of characterized the people that respond to their questions of, how do you score, how do you rate on the VVIQ score, do you have aphantasia or not? It tends to be the case that people who score low on that scale tend to be involved in STEM-related fields, in science and mathematics, but not always. But for example, once their initial study came out, they were contacted by Craig Venter, who is, probably one of the most important, certainly biologists, geneticists, but probably just scientists in, modern history. He was the first person to sequence a human genome. And he said, I'm for sure I have aphantasia. And also, I think it's been an advantage because I don't get bogged down by all that visual nonsense. And I don't know that we can verify that that's actually true. But it also turns out that, and so you might think that, you know, for somebody to engage in more sort of, I don't know, visual-based professions, that, you know, having aphantasia would be a significant problem. But it turns out that a lot of artists respond with aphantasia. And respond by saying that they have aphantasia. And there was actually even an art exhibition in Exeter where they had art from people who would scan as, you know, aphantasiacs and those who would scan as hyperphantasiacs, which we'll get into in a second. And I wasn't able to see the exhibit, but you know, I think that might be interesting to explore whether or not it influences their art. But so Doe Darling, at least was here. I don't know if she still is, but she says that she has aphantasia. And Doe, you know, for anybody that's unfamiliar with what she does, I mean, no matter what it is, it's visually very vivid and stunning. Particularly, you know, some of the makeup that she does is just very remarkable. But despite that, you know, the response was, I have aphantasia, which is very interesting. And so when it comes to the other end of the spectrum, right, of the VVIQ spectrum, people who would, you know, score towards 80, right, where they're scoring, they're you know, responding with a 5 each time, they would be referred to as hyperphantasiacs. And so one of the, and as you were describing, you know, your father seems to have likely been a hyperphantasiac, and he had this, you know, remarkable memory. The Zeeman group at the University of Exeter actually did a comparison between the brains of people who would score as aphantasiacs and hyperphantasiacs. They compared them, and it turned out that there are detectable differences in the brain when you compare somebody with aphantasia to a control, somebody sort of, you know, in the normal spectrum, whatever you want to. Normal is always a loaded term in neuroscience. But then, particularly when you compared aphantasiacs to hyperphantasiacs, there were detectable differences in the brain. And so this does seem to be a real thing, that there are, you know, measurable differences. And so yeah, they also in that 2015 study collected some data on I don't know if you can see this very clearly, unfortunately, but they had some data on, like, well, you know, what these people are like, and one of the unfortunate components of their initial study was that, you know, they had 21 individuals, 19 were male, and so, you know, it might have been nice to have a broader, you know, sample. But as we were talking about dreams, right, 17 out of 21 had visual dreams. So you might expect that the minority would have visual dreams, but it, you know, turned out the majority. And then 2/3 had this this difficulty with autobiographical memory. And it turned out that there were these strengths in their in certain aspects of performance, like verbal strengths, analytical, mathematical. And so it seems that we at least some of us verify that there is this relationship in professions. And so, sorry, I just lost my.
Has there been sorry, in your point there about most of them being male, out of all the people that I've spoken to, a lot of people who are aphantasiacs, it seems that they're more female, but the ones who are hyperphantasia seem to be more male. I don't know if there's been a correlation in the study, or just my pool of victims is low.
It's, you know, it's an interesting question. I don't think that they've really explored that, if there's a relationship there. And clearly for their initial study, you know, they didn't have an ideal sample for that. And, like, you know, we could speculate a little bit, but yeah, I don't think that they've answered that question. So one of the topics that Deanna suggested bringing up, which I find very interesting, would be, you know, to be challenged to visualize something, but visualize something you've never seen or couldn't exist or doesn't exist. And so, you know, she recommends, you know, try and visualize something like an elephant wearing a suit. And so, wait, what just happened? Oh no.
The video is frozen.
Am I back?
You're back.
Yeah.
You are.
Okay, good. Sorry about that. I don't know what happened.
Your video is still frozen.
Is it? Oh, no.
We can hear you fine, but your video is frozen.
Okay, well,
I think
I'm sure
is
it'll
mine.
come back.
No.
But
Okay.
so Deanna, can you do that? Can you visualize, an elephant wearing a suit, or a lollipop turned into a snake, something like that?
Sure. For the elephant, I have the problem that it doesn't fit in the room. But if I imagine a bigger room, then I can put an elephant wearing a suit in it. And it's a question of how does an elephant wear trousers, right? But currently, my elephant has trousers, like 2 sets of trousers.
2 sets of trousers. So.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not. Yeah. 2 sets of trousers, they kind of meet in the middle. So it was like trousers for the back legs, trousers for the front leg, a shirt that goes over most of its body, maybe a tie.
I think I would go with the pants on the back end of the elephant. But
what
what about for you,
legs?
Angela? Can you? I don't know what to tell you.
I have
It's
this
just sort of what
lovely.
came to me.
Yeah, I have this lovely story in my head, but absolutely couldn't visualize it. I played this game with my husband a lot, and so one of the things we did is we would take the names of the cats. So I'd say there's none of the cats in the room. So I'd say, "Can you imagine Tango on the sofa?" And he'd say, "Yeah," and I've just put a top hat on him, and he could do whatever he wanted and create whatever kind of weird concept. So, and Cash, Tango's brother, Cash. If you've not seen the movie, it's an old 80s movie. And Cash has just come into the room riding a small bicycle, and he would watch this whole cinema play out in front of him, and he'd tell me what was going on, and I would just think, okay, you've taken drugs or something.
That is a topic that I would be interested to discuss with somebody who's explored specifically visual hallucinogenic substances, what their experiences are like if they characterize themselves as aphantasiacs. So I'm curious when it was that each of you realized that either you might have some difference in your relationship with visualizing things, or if you realize that other people don't seem to visualize things in the same way. So Deanna, when did you sort of become aware that this was even a potential thing?
I think Anne should explain this because we kind of discovered it at the same time, but it was more her experience than mine.
Yeah, so Mark was always saying, "Oh, I see this, I see that," and I used to say to him, "Not everybody sees things in their mind, kind of very superior." And he was actually listening to the radio one day and heard Professor Adam Zimmern saying about aphantasia and doing this, and he called me at work and said, "Ange, I think you've got aphantasia." And when I came home, we listened to it again, and I said, "Exactly, that's exactly my world." And he was, "Oh, so you really don't see images?" And I was like, "Oh, so you really do see images?" So then at that point we asked the kids, "Do you see images?" And they both said, "Of course." And I realized then that, because it's always been, it's mum's logic when I would say something that they didn't quite visualize, that they couldn't see on the same level as me. It's mum's logic.
But sometimes your logic was messed up.
True, that's true. It was as well. So sometimes it's an excuse, but the aphantasia is a good reason. But when they realized that I genuinely was the isolated one and they were the normal ones, it was actually kind of quite revelationary for me. And so they say, "So you don't see this?" And I'd say, "So you only see it? You don't feel it?" For me, it feels very one-dimensional to just see something. And that's, I guess, where Deanna at that point kind of learned her side was a little bit more on the developed.
Yeah, so then we were asked this question, and it's like, yeah, of course I can visualize these things. Why wouldn't I? Don't you? And at that point, we realized that actually no. And then I went and asked my colleagues, like, "Hey, so what happens when you visualize this?" And everyone gave different answers, and we were like, "Is it just because we're not using the same vocabulary?" So then we were doing some examples of like, okay, put an elephant in a Hawaiian shirt. For some reason, I always default on elephants. So put an elephant in a Hawaiian shirt, and it's like, yeah, it looks a bit funny, but okay. And other people like, but I've never seen one. How do you want me to describe it if I've never seen this? It was cool. And then it was a question that I started asking lots of people, like, "Oh, I know that some people don't do this. Can you see it?" And it was very curious, but yeah, I discovered it when Mum discovered it, and then it's like, oh, that makes a lot of sense now.
Interesting. So just so everybody knows, Angela was describing this scientist, or I guess he's actually a physician who called her. That's Adam Zeman. That is the lead author of essentially the most, the central studies that he coined the term aphantasia, in fact.
Yeah,
and
he's
it had been
actually from
studied.
my hometown.
Oh, you're from Exeter?
Exeter
Or no, maybe.
Exeter. Yeah, Exeter is our hometown.
Very cool. And so, he wasn't necessarily the first to ever study it. People have been interested, scientists have been interested in they didn't call it aphantasia, but, it goes all the way back to Plato and Aristotle, where I believe Aristotle argued that, being able or visualizing things is critical to thinking about anything, whereas Plato suggested that it was pointless and unimportant. And then you move forward in time, and there's Sir Francis Galton, who actually probably came up with the first test. Sir Francis Galton came up with the first test of visualizing things, called the breakfast table. I guess breakfast table, whatever question, where he asked people to imagine the stuff on breakfast table, and he came to argue that there's something here. But I think probably the most critical scientist was Adam Zeman, and Angela has talked to him. Another scientist, for anybody who's familiar, is a guy named Joel Pearson, I believe, down in Australia. He's done some interesting studies, one of which, for example, is this one, where the short story is that you have two groups of people. One group has aphantasia, the other doesn't, and they're asked to do two exercises. First, look at look at a series of images of scary stuff. And then the other challenge is to just read a prompt, right? Read a description of something scary. And it turned out that when the two groups were looking at pictures, they had the same sort of freak out response, right? They had the same level of hot and sweaty. There's something that you cannot control, by your own volition, consciously. But when folks with aphantasia look or had to read descriptions of scary things, they had no real significant reaction at all, whereas people who could visualize things had a pretty substantial reaction. And so, so these studies are going to continue coming out, but again, more evidence that there's something to this. And for me.
Sorry, and just on that point, I watched your broadcast about this the other day, and I thought, I'm going to experiment with this. So a confession that will put me indefinitely in the weird box. I find owls the most creepy and disturbing creatures on the planet.
I don't get it. I love owls.
Yeah, apparently I'm unique in this, but there you go. And if I see a picture of an owl, my first reaction is, ugh. And it's not something I control. It's not something I even try to do. It's not an intention. It's an automatic reaction. So after watching your broadcast the other day, I thought, owl, 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 owl. 10 owls, 50 owls blinking at me. Nothing.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I should challenge myself to do that. Because the reason that I find this interesting is that, and I should note that these descriptions are rather simple, but they're supposed to be visually, evocative, right? But for me, when I read science fiction, I definitely have very emotional reactions. I mean, I can be moved to tears by reading, and so it would be an interesting thing to explore, my own reaction there. So I apologize if I missed any comments here. And so it's like I'm. So Joe says it's like I'm.
That somebody mentioned earlier about drawing, and myself and a group of aphants tried this a while ago. So we were talking about drawing and whether you're a good drawer or not. So we all desperately tried to draw a frog with our eyes closed or without our eyes closed. But a frog is an image that most people, I would say normal people, can see or imagine. So we all drew a frog and shared it on Zoom with varying levels of success. And Deanna, I think I sent you a photo of my frog.
Yeah, and I sent you one back.
Yeah, and it would have given you nightmares, my frog. It had one eye up here and one eye over there, and it just looked nothing like a frog. And your frog, which you drew from memory, I guess,
with my eyes closed. Yeah, I think, close your eyes, try to draw it and see how well you do. And I could draw a pretty accurate frog. I mean, I'm not great at drawing, but it was clearly a frog. Yours seemed to be a Picasso frog.
A Picasso frog.
So technically a frog, but it is. So they have done another study when it comes to and by the way, so I am terrible. I'm a terrible artist, but several members of my extended family were very accomplished artists, and so I'll have to ask them. Well, I can't ask one of them, but I'll have to ask the other if how they rank on the aphantasia scale. And so yes, there is a study that was conducted when, with people who have aphantasia, when they see a face, for all of us, everybody, when you see a face, the way that you're able to recognize that face or recognize that it is a face is via activity in a certain part of the brain called the fusiform gyrus. It's one of those very rare examples where like a very specific part of the brain directly correlates with a very specific thing that we do. And so whenever any of us look at a face, we have activity in this brain region. However, when people were asked to remember a face, and I am very bad at this, this is one of the, before I even knew that aphantasia was a type of thing, I knew that I was unusually bad at remembering people's faces. When people, normal people or people without aphantasia are asked to do so, they have activity in the fusiform gyrus. Makes sense. After all, that is the part of the brain that becomes active when we're looking at faces. But when people with aphantasia are asked to remember a face, there is no activity in that brain region, which is an interesting phenomenon. Again, suggesting that there's something to it. So how would a train wear a skirt?
Sorry, go ahead.
Please, no, please go ahead.
During one of our family of four discussions on what we can visualize and what we can't, my son covered the lower half of his face and said to me, which side of my nose is my mole on? And I did the very unmaternal thing and said, do you have a mole on your face?
Very interesting. So Deanna, how are you at remembering faces?
I think I'm usually pretty good. If it's somebody who, if I have a name attached to the face, I'm pretty good. But I'm sure Andrew will remember a story as a kid where there was an actor in a film who changed his hat, and I got really confused, like, who is this guy? We haven't seen him, and we were halfway into the movie. And I just got so confused because he changed his hat and I couldn't identify him anymore. But apart from occasional things like that, I am usually pretty good at remembering faces. I'm very bad at remembering where I know people from. It's like I can bring up somebody's face. It's like, okay, I know this person. I've met him 100 times, but where? And that's a bit harder.
The other side of that is how many times did we have to, back in the old days when you had to press pause on a video, did I say, so who's that guy again? It's his mother. Oh,
yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And I actually had a claim to fame moment. I actually met one of my all-time favorite actors, met him in a German beer garden and sat and chatted with him for about an hour and had a fabulous conversation. Took a random photo, sent it to my husband, and he said, "You're having lunch with him?" Oh, because I couldn't make the connection with any film he wasn't. I just did not know who he was.
Wow, that's pretty funny. Yeah, that's it's like, I've been with my well, even if I try and conjure my parents, faces, I've been around them for quite a long time. Can't do it. I have to remember other things, like the sort of their voice, their sort of general disposition. And so Stanley says that probably my career choice as well, hit a roadblock in chemistry in university, did great in biology and human anatomy, went into carpentry. Interesting. So for me, organic chemistry is one of the classes that I think most people who end up going into science have to take. And I loved organic chemistry, and specifically I loved the spatial component of organic chemistry, where you had to imagine how molecules would physically interact with each other. It's very difficult to do OChem if you can't do that. And then same for anatomy. I did rely on, a sort of pseudo-visual exercise. But once again, I think if I could actually see the things, I would probably would have gotten better grades. Let's put it that way.
That's where you can really, you have all the molecules in their composition, right?
Organic chemistry?
Yeah. Where
so
you draw
it's
hexagons and put lines everywhere.
yeah, correct.
Yeah, I love that one. It was just like draw it, bring it up in my mind. That was the only part of chemistry I actually did well with.
Same here. Yeah, I loved organic chemistry. For me, it was sort of like the language of at least the parts of the universe with which I interact most directly. And so Abyss says, well, I question my admiration when it comes to Craig Venter. He also wanted to commercialize the Human Genome Project. I certainly don't admire him. I think probably most scientists throughout history warrant a bit of skepticism when it comes to their personal, who they were as a person. Certainly Sir Francis Galton, for example, contributed some very, very important innovations in science, but also contributed, one of the pioneers of eugenics. So I always separate the scientific contributions of somebody from their personal politics or whatever it might be. And certainly, there are plenty of scientists active today who are much worse than privateers of science, but they still have contributed important science. Okay.
So Ian, I have a question for you.
Please.
So because it's a topic that me and Ange are moving places soon, so we've talked about it a lot. Like if you move into a new place and you have a completely empty room and you have all of your furniture, can you kind of imagine where you come up with a layout for your furniture? Can you imagine what it looks like, or do you actually literally have to put all the pieces there to figure out whether it looks good or not? Because for me and my dad, it was always we just like draw up the mental image, sofa goes there, table goes there, and I'm like, no, this doesn't work, let's try something else. And Angie's response was always, but we haven't tried it, how do you know it doesn't work? Like, it doesn't work, I can tell you for sure it doesn't work. So what's your experience with that?
That's an interesting. That's a great prompt. Wish I had thought about that earlier. Yeah, I can't do that. I can imagine the sizes a little bit. Like I can tell that this isn't going to fit through this door, or where something would look good on a wall, like art and stuff like that. And I am like very aesthetically driven, far more so than my wife, who is not an aphantasiac. Like I care a lot about what our furniture looks like and the art that we have on the wall and the textures of things and if they're sort of compatible. But for sure, I am not relying on my capability to visualize things. Yeah, I've always been terrible at that. Maybe, and that might be part of the reason for why virtual reality for me, when it became good, was so magical, where, or augmented reality, where you can actually just like use a device or something and it'll do that work for you. But yeah, I can't do that. What about you, Angela? Can you imagine those spatial relationships?
No. Too many stories of things not fitting through doors, and not. I say, oh, it's this size, get home, and it's not. And living with 3 people who are at least 3, 4, or 5s on the same spectrum as me, and at the time we didn't know why. This was why it was often mum's logic, because I'd say, I'm sure this pot plant is the size I need, so I'm going to get this one. And 3 other people would say, that's smaller than the one you've got at home, but up to you. So I would get home and, okay, right, fine. And I think I've just made a connection, Deanna, with you have this thing about pictures being straight on the wall, and if not, they drive you crazy. So I guess part of it is because even if you're not looking at the picture, you can still see it in your mind that it's wonky.
That brain picture that you had for months, wonky on your wall, was driving me crazy, even though I never actually saw it in person. It's like, why would you keep it wonky?
Because the only time I see it is when I look at it, so then it doesn't bother me.
No, it ruins the aesthetic of the room. So there's a related comment there from Scott about drawing up the floor plan. That's something else. Yeah, that's something else. Like, if you give me a floor plan, I can walk around the place. I can tell you exactly where everything belongs. I think you have a very different response to floor plans.
I had this. So I'm moving to a place, and I sent Deanna a bunch of photos. This is my place. Half an hour later, she sent me this map, because I was thinking, right, so I've got the washroom is on top of the bedroom, and I couldn't create a 3D image out of a bunch of photos. So she drew a floor plan, and when I actually went to visit the place, it was pretty spot on, and she constructed this just from photos.
And I put numbers where every photo was taken from on the floor plan to make it easier for you to put all the photos together.
I can't tell you how frustrating it is to live with somebody like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I empathize.
So Ian, if I give you a floor plan, can you like see the place? Can
no,
you go from a floor plan?
nope, no
That's
way.
so
No, I
curious.
mean, like like they're informative in so far as I can imagine how big a room is. You know, like if it's 10 by 10 or if it's smaller. That is really the only information that I extract from a floor plan. Also, like where's the bathroom relative to the kitchen, that kind of thing. But yeah, there is zero visual component for me. It's just the facts. And so I would be remiss if I didn't bring up another thing. So we were talking about how, generally speaking, people with aphantasia tend to aggregate in certain professions, very general, total generalization, and, probably really needs to be replicated. But there do seem to be some advantages to having aphantasia. Not many. I would definitely trade any purported advantages for being able to visualize a floor plan. But it seems to be the case that people with aphantasia are able to deal with grief, to deal with traumatic experiences more effectively. They're able to sort of move on a bit more rapidly. And there are some folks who this is jarring to them because they feel as though they should be grieving more when, when there's a shared trauma and the people around them are very deeply affected by it, whereas they're not. And so, that can be potentially considered an advantage. So you're not tormented by, the recurrence of certain images. And that is the hypothesis would be that it is that lack of visualization that enables people to move on a little bit more rapidly. Again, generalizations, not necessarily the case for everybody. And I would also be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that the former president of Pixar, right, the company that makes all those lovely animated films like Finding Nemo, I think it was Finding Nemo, those types of movies, right? He characterizes himself as having aphantasia. So just because you can't visualize things doesn't necessarily put you in a category of people that cannot engage the arts. And so, okay, so Joel Schultz asks, do you tilt a picture of the Leaning Tower of Pisa to make it stand straight, or do you make the frame parallel to the walls? Yeah, maybe that torments Deanna.
Yeah, the frame has to be parallel to the wall. That's absolute. This is a problem when I had a house where one of the walls was slightly wonky. That drove me crazy.
There's that Harry Potter meme where now people are like intentionally keeping a bunch of pictures all like tilted weirdly. I'm not. That's not a compelling aesthetic for me either. But
just touching
yeah,
on your subject of grief there, if you don't mind me adding there, I'm
Please.
sure as most people know, Deanna and I lost her father, my husband, 10 months ago today, in fact. So we're both in a unique position to comment on this, on that. I think in one way it does definitely help having aphantasia because I would prefer to remember the feelings and the emotion and the memories of my husband rather than images. I think the concept of remembering who he was and who he is to me is more important than remembering his face.
Yeah, I can understand that. Adam, of course, I'm so sorry for your loss.
I think it's something we've also mentioned because a lot of grief books will start with visualize your loss, visualize your loved one. And I can do that, right? And obviously you cannot. So you have to find other ways of dealing with it.
Yeah, it says things like visualize your partner sat on the sofa or your loved one sat on the sofa next to you holding your hand. And I think, well, I can't, so I know how that would feel, and it's more of the sentiment of how it would feel. I can imagine the feelings, the emotion, the strong emotion that I was with Mark for forever. But seeing him on the sofa next to me is not a relevant helping technique, and also impossible. It's the same as coming back to the elephant in the suit. It's I have as much chance of the elephant in the suit as, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Vader just realised we were related.
Yeah, we didn't. If anyone came in late, they might have missed that. Yeah, that's my amazing mom. Yeah.
That's my amazing daughter right there.
But it also has the other side of the grief thing that, for an example, if I hear a song that my dad used to sing a lot, it will immediately play in my mind in his voice. I will hear him in my mind singing this. Even if it's playing on the radio, I will hear his version of it in my mind. And if I'm cooking or doing something and I'm not ready for that, that is a shock. And it's like, oh God. And that's when grief hits me the most. So these moments where these images or these like mental images come into my mind. And it's like, oh, I was not ready for that. But on the other hand, I do get to relive that experience of him singing this song. So it has both aspects. It has the good and the bad aspect. I think it's just, in general, different ways of really approaching grief.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that, I mean, for me, if I hear that the same song as you would hear it in Dad's voice, whereas I would feel the way it made him feel and the way he thought about it. So I would feel the emotional aspect of it. This song always made him laugh. This song always made him jump for joy or dance ABBA with Deanna. That's a story that one day I'm going to get a video of Deanna and her dad doing ABBA songs with
we destroyed all video evidence
and the whole thing. But for me, it's more of the enjoyment of the music that Mark felt from that. So for me, it's more of a positive thing than the negative.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. And I mean, you're undoubtedly absolutely right about that, Deanna, that grief is not so simple as just the sensory components, right? As a, you know, from my perspective, the emotional components are clearly what drive that. But thank you both very much for sharing. That's I really appreciate it. Very insightful. So we have cajoled Abyss to join our conversation for as long as we're still going to hang out. And so Abyss, is there anything, so Abyss is a data scientist, background in science and engineering. You know, pick your topic. Was there anything that came up that inspired you to want to join us?
Yeah, so I guess like it's well, before like this conversation kind of evolved into a very sombering one about remembering loved ones with absolute vividness, and that its impact on to trying to move on with some of the memories. But then again, it kind of reminded me that some of the difficulties that I have with being like somehow a visual learner or someone who can visualize things in a much more vivid way, much like Deanna. And that is like if I have, say, like an image of a person, I can recall that with absolute clarity the first time, second time. But the more I do it, the details would start to smear off, like, you know, over some time. I don't know if it's just me or if it's anybody else. And the best explanation that I found is that it's like how you know, witnesses to some kind of crime would actually you know, like their details just start to kind of fade off. Like they have absolute recollection when it first happened because they are at the moment of stress and their memory is like really sharp. It's right there and engaging. But as time moves on, that you kind of see that this effect where, you know, they kind of miss out the details or something like that, and they might even like go on a different level, like, or at least they can try to recall something that never happened entirely. Yeah.
Right.
So I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, and that was something that Christian Zasa brought up when I chatted about aphantasia last time, which is like, you know, our reliance on eyewitness testimony for criminal proceedings is fraught for a variety of reasons, beyond just the fact that not all of us visualize things in the same way, clearly. But yeah, I mean, you know, that component, the memory component to the visualization that you're conjuring is very malleable, and you know, things can change over time. Yeah, that is an interesting ramification of the diversity and how we visualize things. You did answer in the chat, Abyss, but where do you land on the 1 to 5 scale?
So I would rate myself as probably a solid 4, sometimes a 5. And that all depends on like the details of the information. So if you want me to visualize a butterfly, the first thing that I would go is for like probably visualize a monarch butterfly, because these are very very noticeable ones. But if you want to specify the color and everything, I can also do that. But if I have to visualize the details, I may provide like a still image in my mind, as opposed to like something vivid entirely, made of like a movie, or at least like have some frames to it. So that's been my at least like that's been my experience pretty much with aphantasia. But like I said, it depends on my lucidity. Like when I'm at that wake and sleep state, like right in the middle, I find myself inundated with so much visuals that I cannot even describe. Some of them I have absolute control over, most of them I don't. So yeah, just wanted to share my experience and see if there's anybody out there who actually experiences the same thing.
Can I ask a bit? Do you find that distracting from getting on with stuff?
I used to. So I kind of went into this self exercise where I would probably have to reduce like this. I guess that for me was kind of like daydreaming. But yeah, so I would probably exercise some kind of self restraint to kind of actively engage in the day. But yeah, growing up was kind of difficult. I was pretty much disengaged, not all the time, but in some part. I used to find solace and comfort in my own visualizations.
Wow. It's very interesting perspective that for me, I would absolutely not change the way that I don't see things. But Ian, you said would you change it?
Well, one of the comments that you made when we were chatting about our plan to have this conversation was whether or not you see this as a deficiency or just something else. For me, I don't see it as a deficiency, and that is one of the aspects of the conversation around aphantasia that I don't love, is the sort of kind of medicalization of it, where you have aphantasia, right? And I can understand from the perspective of somebody who has acquired aphantasia, right? They had a stroke or an injury of some sort, and now all of a sudden they have aphantasia. But it's like when you ask somebody who has synesthesia, right? Do you wish that you weren't distracted by all these the crossing of senses, which can be slightly debilitating? I had a friend whose father had a form of synesthesia where when he hears a sound, he has a color perception. And he had to be very careful when he was driving. It's potentially dangerous, particularly when he was driving his son, my friend. But if you ask them if you wish that you saw the universe in a normal way, or the way that most people see it, they oftentimes say, no, this is all I've ever known. This is my relationship with the universe. I've grown up with this relationship with the universe. And, it has made me who I am today. And so, I was sort of joking when I said, like, I would swap, the ability to move on for, the ability to see, to visualize a floor plan. What I really wish I could do is experience what somebody else is visualizing for, acute periods of time, for 15 minutes, what it would be like to see the world through, Deanna's eyes, or, someone with hyperphantasia. But no, I don't think I would swap it. But what about you, Angela?
Definitely not. I feel an image is, people say an image paints 1,000 words. Yeah, but for me, you have to stare at it long enough to absorb it. Whereas coming back to the songs that we were saying just now, whereas I don't hear it in anybody's voice, not even in, let's say, Chrissy Hines' voice. And if anybody says who's Chrissy Hines, you'll get beaten up by me. Whoever it is, if it's Tchaikovsky's music. I don't hear the actual music, but I feel the way it makes me feel, the way that the impact is much bigger than just a vision. And I think the vision, for me, the vision would fade, but the feeling, the effect, the hair standing on the back of my neck, this is so much more powerful than just an image.
Yeah, I think yes, and you know, I think that there is another potential component to it where, you know, people who are blind, which, you know, people with aphantasia are not blind, but people who are begin to rely much more on their other sensory systems, right, to navigate the world. You know, this isn't a perfect comparison because humans are so, in terms of our incoming sensory information, are so visually driven. But so I think as a result, I don't think it's too much of a stretch to suggest that people who score very low on the, you know, VVIQ scale, right, people who would be characterized as having aphantasia, I don't think it's a stretch to suggest that they therefore had to rely, or we therefore have to rely a bit more on other components of our consciousness, whether it's emotional, other sensory systems, you know, other cognitive tools to remember things. Like, you know, I definitely can't remember what a page looks like, what my cheat sheet looked like in graduate school. And so, you know, where there's, you know, it's just part of you know, neurodiversity, right? Where there's less of a capability here, there can be a much greater capability there. And it's going to be interesting to see how these topics are explored. You know, I can tell that Adam Zeman has a lot of support behind him. The winds are in his sails, and I'm sure we're going to see many more scientists begin to enter this field. And part of the reason I love aphantasia is as a topic is that I think it's one of those really fun topics that enables us to explore the contours of how all of our consciousnesses are different. And how we all see the world in slightly different ways, sculpted by both our past experiences, our life experiences, but also the genetics that we inherited from our parents, right? The anatomy, the physical anatomy that we inherited. So I'm going to be keeping my eyes on this topic as time moves forward. And so I just wanted to ask, do any of you all have any other things, you know, any other closing thoughts before we conclude? Maybe Deanna?
Yeah, I think it's a super interesting topic, and it's really interesting to see how people experience the world differently. Right? I mean, it's something we all know that the way I see red is perhaps not the same way as how you see red. But this whole thing, I think, if people are not aware of it, it can be surprising. Like when we found out there was an actual explanation to Mum's logic, it suddenly made a lot of sense and a lot of things clicked. And like these virtual chess games that I would attempt to have with my dad, and my mum thought we were crazy, and now it makes sense why she thought we were crazy, because you couldn't actually see it. I think my closing thought is, as always, it's so good to talk to people with other experiences because it will broaden your own appreciation. Like I now really have to think about what does it mean to visualize something, and that's because of these conversations. So I think my closing thought would be, you know, talk to the people in your life if they have aphantasia, because it's a really fun topic to explore, and it will let you understand your own mind a bit more as well. So yeah, thanks for putting this together, Ian, and do go out and chat to everybody about this topic.
Oh, I will. Yeah, I'll just randomly ask people as I'm doing completely other topics. Just, hey, can you visualize a butterfly for me?
Yeah, maybe don't start like stopping people on the street and asking them.
Well, that's what I was doing in the lab,
actually, literally. No wonder they all hate you. I think you can take it further, because you mentioned briefly about seeing colors with things. We should ask people about what they experience. Do you see colors do you see sounds with colors? Do you see a number with a color? Because for some people, unless they're asked and realize you do, you don't realize that there's so much difference between people. You just all assume that the way you're experiencing the world is the way everybody else is. And I think it's very interesting, as Deanna says, ask people, how do you see this? How do you hear this? It's very interesting.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And, you know, it's just one of many topics in neuroscience that enables us to appreciate that, you know, that diversity in worldview and, you know, in perception and so on. Abyss, I know you weren't with us for the majority of the conversation, but do you have any closing thoughts you'd like to share, or have you shared what you were thinking about?
Yeah, I think most of it has been said by Deanna and Angela about this, and much to my surprise, I actually had the same discussion with others that also proclaim to have aphantasia, and with a neuroscientist in presence on a different platform, and we had like a very prolonged discussion, and so yeah, it seems like there is a sort of like a public awareness when it comes to aphantasia, not taking it as a symptom or trying to associate it with any kind of problem. But yeah, it's really important to have some kind of awareness instilled in the construct of, at least like in the mind of society, so that the people from all sorts of neurodiversity can be included, and how to define things and how to visualize things, and how to effectively communicate with each other. So yeah.
Yeah, and also, yeah, the deficiencies in language, like how we're so limited in, we have to spend 15 minutes distinguishing the terms visualize and imagine. Angela, well, I don't know if those were your closing thoughts. Do you have any other
Pretty much, yeah.
thoughts?
Also, really thank you for putting this together, because I think it's fascinating to speak to other aphants as well, but also somebody who understands the brain in such a clear way. I think for you it must be an absolute fascination. It is for me. It's fascinating to me how people like Deanna, we didn't cover it, and I'll just very briefly say Deanna and her dad used to write messages on the wall in invisible ink, so only each other could say, I've left you a message, remember to buy the eggs when you go to the shop or whatever, and they would see it, and I think it's fascinating how they see the world. So for you, who understands the brain a lot more, I think it must be very fascinating. So I really appreciate you putting this together. Thank you.
Oh, thank you all for joining. And I wish, I'm going to be looking forward to seeing if my daughter shares my ability to visualize, or my wife's, who does not have aphantasia, because so far my daughter has been actually just writing on the walls with crayons. I would much prefer the invisible ink. And so, yes, thank you all for joining so much, and taking the time out. I appreciate hearing your insights, your personal experiences. I'm looking forward to having chats again in the future with all of you. But until then, thanks everybody for checking it out. Oh, and if you're watching this, wherever you're watching this, check out Deanna Hooper, DC Hooper, and she's on HAPS. You can follow her. She's a theoretical physicist focusing on dark matter. She does regular streams, invites folks from within her discipline to join and chat. So you should check her out and subscribe. Angela every now and then does a stream as well, and so you can check her out. Abyss, probably the best place to engage Abyss would be on the app Clubhouse, but he's also on HAPS. Has done a stream every now and then, so you can check out his stuff. And if you're not subscribed to my channel, I would appreciate it. If you would subscribe if you enjoy these kinds of conversations, maybe a like or whatever it is, if you're watching on YouTube or on haps.com. Otherwise, I will see you all next week. Thanks for joining, everybody.
Thanks, Ian.